Hi, this is Robert Garmong, philosopher and educator, coming to you once again from my super professional studio here in Dalian, China. A number of people have remarked on the rather Spartan circumstances here, and I promise you, I do understand this. However, I only started making these videos because of the coronavirus quarantine, the very same quarantine that makes it a little difficult to get things like professional looking backdrops and better lighting and so on. So please bear with me. I appreciate those comments, and I will endeavor to fix it as soon as I can. Now, today I want to talk about something that often causes friction between foreigners and their Chinese friends. And that is that, to us foreigners, Chinese can seem awfully touchy about criticism of China. In part, this foreigner's attitude is a result of what I call politics without mirrors. In other words, the policy of angrily denouncing some behavior on the other side of some partisan divide while ignoring the very same behavior on your side of the divide. So if you think foreigners aren't touchy about their home countries, then you haven't been in some of the same conversations that I've been. Some of it, though, is real. For example, the Chinese outrage over one NBA coach siding with Hong Kong protesters has no direct parallel in the US. Likewise, boycotts of Western brands for failing to account for Chinese claims of sovereignty over Taiwan and various other locations. Now, foreigners totally understand arguments, disagreements over policies, and the like, but they often find it hard to understand the degree of lamentation, personal aggrievement, and literal tears shed over a concert t-shirt. Part of this is that foreigners aren't used to the extreme unanimity of belief in China. They don't understand the degree to which China is a collectivist society, so the individual is culturally strongly pushed to identify himself or herself with China and therefore hold to the Chinese belief. Now, I'm an American, I'll always be American, and I'm proudly so, but if you criticize America or some aspect of American government policy, or if you argue that, I don't know, Texas should be a separate country, which some people do argue. Now, I may agree with you, I may disagree with you, I may not like what you've said, but in most cases it's not going to feel like a dagger to my heart or a profound assault on my identity. Foreigners also recognize the distinction between the government and the country or the culture that is, for example, America. So I may myself have strong objections against certain government policies, such as the current trade war that the Trump administration started, without losing any of my allegiance to America. This would be much harder for most Chinese people to maintain because they've been drummed their whole lives with the formula, you are China and China is the government. But today I want to focus on a different issue, and it's actually one of the things that I think is great about China, that foreigners often don't fully understand or appreciate. That is China's cultural pride. And by cultural pride, I mean the sense of cultural greatness and its people's sense that China has and should have a place right alongside the US on the world stage. And this, to be honest, is one of the main reasons I chose to come to China in the first place. It was because I see China as one of the great world cultures with a legitimate claim to grandeur on the world stage. Notwithstanding the various ways that I criticized Chinese culture and Chinese government, I was drawn here because there are so many ways in which I admire China and I see it as great, and in some cases better than the US. And once I got here, that palpable feeling of cultural pride was one of the things that I immediately loved about China and its people. It's one of the natural points of connection, in my opinion, between the US and China, because our sense of cultural pride is actually extremely similar in many details that no other country, I think, has quite the same sense of cultural pride that the two of us have. So I want to talk first about pride a little bit. That word is used in ways that are quite ambiguous, some of them quite negative. Pride goeth before a fall, and pride is one of the 7 deadly sins. But when I talk about pride, I mean it in the sense of the philosophers discuss, where Ayn Rand, for example, defined pride as moral ambitiousness. In other words, it's the desire to make of yourself the greatest person that you can be. It's what Aristotle called megalosoukeia, or greatness of soul, as it's translated into English. Now, when I apply that idea to cultural pride, I don't mean just loving your country, because you can love all sorts of things about the place you came from. Maybe you love the food you grew up with, or the music, or the geography, or even that characteristic smell of the soil on a spring morning. I come from the Midwest. It's a thing. But that's not what I mean by cultural pride. I mean the conscious, intentional acceptance and admiration of the ideas and values that make up a culture. And it's not even necessarily tied to your place of birth. I know immigrants to the U.S. who have far more American cultural pride than many natural-born Americans do. After all, they chose to go through the sometimes arduous process of becoming Americans, whereas schlumps like me just got born there. Now, China has an immense amount to feel proud of. And if you don't believe me, just ask yourself, how did China become the 2nd largest economy in the world? Or by some measures, the 1st. They didn't do it by collecting box tops, and they didn't inherit it from their parents. A generation ago, this country was poor and starving. They did it by being a culture that values hard work and productiveness, and that values family connections in a way that specifically does help build their economic success. They work together. They did it by valuing education, although I think the Chinese educational system is badly flawed. The idea of education is very strong here, and I would argue that many people get a good education in spite of the educational system rather than because of it. But it is a top value of Chinese culture. Now, historically, for most of China's history, China was not only a great culture, it was arguably the greatest in the world. I'm going to go into this a lot more detail, I hope, in another video, but for now, just bear in mind that this is something Chinese people are acutely aware of. The U.S. has about 400 years of history, with 250 as its own country. China has thousands of years of cultural greatness. Now, if you're old enough, you might remember those old Charles Atlas ads that used to be in the backs of comic books and cheap magazines. And the story was always in cartoon form, where a skinny little guy is on the beach and a big strong man comes up and kicks sand in his face. The scrawny guy is humiliated, he goes home, and he gets on the Charles Atlas program, and by the final frame of the cartoon, he's buffed up and becomes strong enough to go get revenge on the big guy who had embarrassed him in the first frame. But now imagine that in reverse. Imagine it's a big, strong, well-mannered, well-educated guy in this case, and some rude, uneducated, skinny little twerp comes up and kicks sand in his face. And then somehow that little twerp ends up beating him up ignominiously. And this keeps happening over years and years. Now, in his mind, he's still the strong man at the center of the universe. But somehow, in reality, he's continually humiliated. Imagine what that would do to that guy's psychology. It would be as if all the laws of physics and ethics were suddenly inverted. Up is down, black is white. Now, do you think that guy might be a little sensitive to insult? Now, let's say you're the Charles Atlas in this scenario, and you're going to give him well-meaning advice on how to regain his position in the world. You might want to approach that guy with some sensitivity to his past. You might also want to be aware of, or at least open to the possibility, that there are ways that he had it right and the scrawny little guy had it wrong. So just to take one recent example at the time that I'm making this video, a recent Wall Street Journal editorial referred to China during this coronavirus outbreak as the real sick man of Asia. That was the headline. Now that was a clever headline and it made perfect sense to a Westerner's eyes, and a foreigner wouldn't understand necessarily why Chinese people would get upset about it. But they did. And the government, in fact, responded by expelling 3 Wall Street Journal reporters from China. And these were people who had nothing to do with the editorial in the first place. So it was completely unfair to them. And don't get me wrong, I in no way condone the Chinese assaults on free speech in this or many other cases. That is not the proper function of government. However, I understand why they felt the need to do it in this case. The original phrase, the sick man of, had nothing to do with China. It was applied to the Turkish Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, and the phrase was the sick man of Europe, not Asia. But it ties right into that Chinese Charles Atlas feeling of humiliation. So what they did was not right, but it was totally understandable, if you can understand that distinction. Now, being a foreigner doesn't mean that you have no right to assess China, its culture, and its politics. Judgment is essential to being a rational person. We have to do it. Which country do I want to live in? Which parts of the culture should I accept and which should I avoid? What will improve my life and what will bring it down? Judgment is how we survive. But we as foreigners need to assess China as objectively and as fairly as we can. And on the flip side, our Chinese friends need to be able to see the difference between a cheap shot, and believe me, I've seen plenty of those, versus reasoned criticism. I'm a philosopher. That means a critical thinker. And that means sometimes I'm going to disagree with aspects of Chinese culture and government. There's much that I love about this country and much that I disagree with. The bargain that I'm asking for is this. I will do my best to be fair, objective, and open to reasoned arguments from those who disagree with me, if you will grant me the same. And to all other foreigners, I would urge you to accept the same bargain. If you wonder why Chinese people are so touchy about China, please take this same approach. Try to understand a little of the philosophical and historical reasons for it, and do your best to be a sympathetic critic. A critic, to be sure, but a sympathetic one. In other words, don't be that guy. So thank you for listening. As always, please hit like and subscribe. It helps more people find my videos on YouTube.